This is Halo 5 Guardians, just 3 months into development. Development of Halo 5 started right after Halo 4 shipped in November of 2012, and 343 wanted Halo 5 to be a big leap forward for the franchise. The original storyline for Halo 5 included a bigger emphasis on the relationship of Master Chief and Dr. Halsey, alongside having the Didact play a much more prominent role. They also had a lot of issues with transitioning the underlying engine from the Xbox 360 to the Xbox One. Today, I will go over the entire 3-year development cycle of Halo 5 and show you exactly how 343 evolved their studio for their sophomore effort with Halo. Development of Halo 5 started right after Halo 4 shipped in 2012. In the first couple of months, the hunt began to find someone to lead creative vision for the game. Coming off of Halo 4, the engine really began to show its limitations. While Halo 4 looked incredible at the time, it was more or less an expansion to Halo Reach in terms of how it utilizes the BLAM engine. The first comparison that comes to mind is Halo 3 to Halo 3 ODST, where it's a very different type of game, but the underlying engine is similar if not identical to what Halo 3 ran on. During the development of Halo 4, the brand new team who was getting familiar with the engine flagged areas where the engine needed improvement, and towards the end of Halo 4's development, higher-ups promised dedicated time to upgrade the BLAM engine to something creatives wouldn't have to fight to build in. But unfortunately, with development of the Master Chief Collection and Halo 5's development happening simultaneously, they didn't have enough firepower to upgrade the engine, so teams were forced to Frankensteining solutions, especially with a planned jump up to 60 frames per second. During the first couple of months of pre-production, 343 began developing concepts of what the campaign would be. The original plan was to continue the storyline started in Halo 4 with the return of the Didact. We would have seen the Forerunners become an even bigger threat by taking over the Covenant and having Forerunner Covenant hybrid enemies for us to fight. The original script, which was cut very early on for unknown reasons, would have involved the Chief on the run from the UNSC in order to find Dr. Halsey, who was working with Jul Mandama, the leader of a Covenant rebellion group. Oni would then label the Chief as AWOL and paint him as a traitor to humanity and have Spartan Locke on the hunt for him. Locke would then meet up with the Arbiter, who's mentoring him, and since the Arbiter can recognize when a corrupt organization is manipulating someone, tells Locke to look past Oni's propaganda of Chief and Blue Team. Eventually, the game would end with Halsey and the elites activating the Guardians and decimating humanity's stronghold on the galaxy. The end scene of the game would have involved the Guardians jumping to a Halo ring, where it'd be revealed that the Didact was the one orchestrating everything and planning his final battle against humanity. Again, this rough draft of a storyline was cut in favor of Cortana returning, since 343 wanted to establish a new major antagonist instead of continuing the story of the Didact. This is pure speculation at this point, but I think one of the major reasons behind this was that 343 wanted to set up multiple different Halo games. They had made many comments at this point that their original trilogy of games, meaning Halo 4, 5, and 6, would evolve into a saga instead, and that it wouldn't be limited to just 3 games. In terms of how the campaign gameplay would play like, Tim Longo, who was the creative director for Star Wars Republic Commando, was brought on during the pre-production phase of development around April of 2013. Tim was a really important piece of the puzzle for the campaign. In Republic Commando, you had a squadron following you around throughout gameplay. His expertise in squadron-based combat and 343's desire to expand the character sets of Halo meshed together perfectly. On the campaign side, 343 talked a lot about the ambition of continuing to tell Chief's story, but not relying solely on playing through the Master Chief's eyes. They talked about designing a campaign experience that would be cooperative by nature and that would support cooperative play with defined characters that you can jump in and out of. What that would become, who those characters would be, what the story is, and how exactly it would be told, those are all things that Tim Longo led. The game was shaping up to be one of the most cooperative Halo games ever made, so what could go wrong? While the campaign teams were forming what the story of the game would be like, the multiplayer teams had their own concerns at evolving Halo's multiplayer. They were really terrified by the huge drop in players after Halo 4 shipped. One of the biggest reasons why Halo 4 dropped off was its radically different multiplayer compared to the previous Halo entries. During the development of Halo 4, they really wanted to capture the Call of Duty audience at the expense of alienating the Halo audience. So for Halo 5, it was decided pretty early on that this game would revert back to even starts with no loadouts. In addition to reverting back to even starts, 343 started prototyping different Spartan abilities. They wanted a heightened mobility, and one of the ways they would do this is by adding thrusters, sliding, clambering, shoulder charge, and ground pounds. They were also experimenting with adding a double jump, but this was cut from the final release due to there being too many different abilities that would have been a nightmare for balancing for competitive play. On the other side of the coin, the multiplayer team was also hard at work at evolving big team battle with Warzone. The idea of a PvPvE game mode was originally being planned for Halo 4, but was cut from that game due to the lack of resources available at the time. While the campaign teams were going through a bit of a rough time with figuring out where to take the campaign, the multiplayer teams were actually doing pretty good. In fact, they were doing so good, one of the earliest vertical slices of Halo 5 was actually the arena multiplayer. A vertical slice is when you have a build of a game with no bugs and very little amounts of placeholder or temporary assets. Since at this point, the game still had 2 more years before it was released, 343 would release a teaser trailer at E3 2013 to showcase the new direction Halo was heading. At E3 2013, to coincide with the reveal of the Xbox One, 343 would give a short teaser for Halo 5. One interesting tidbit about this reveal is that they hadn't officially revealed the full title of the game, only that it was the next Halo game, and strangely enough, a release date for 2014. This wouldn't be technically wrong, as the Master Chief Collection would be released in 2014, but it's a bit weird to see Halo 5 being advertised as coming next year with this trailer, which is great foreshadowing for marketing and Halo 5, but more on that in a bit. Back to the development of Halo 5, by mid-2013 to early 2014, the campaign teams spent time developing the environments of Halo 5. Since at this point the story with Cortana was solidified, they began building out the actual worlds that the game would take place on. Originally, the game was supposed to take place over just one planet, but this would evolve into 4 planets and 1 ship. As the environmental teams worked on the play spaces, the gameplay teams were working on the cooperative nature of Halo 5. As every mission would have 3 other Spartans alongside your journey with you, they wanted to focus on making sure the teammates were actually useful and not just cannon fodder. I'm not too sure this was executed that well in the final version of the game, as the Spartan companions were a bit dumb and would get stuck quite often. But as development continued on the gameplay side of the campaign, the lack of iteration on the engine side really started to catch up with 343. In order to hit their 60 FPS frame rate target for Halo 5, they implemented a dynamic resolution scaling solution that would scale the game's resolution from 720p to 1080p dynamically. During actual gameplay though, the resolution would always end up on the lower end of that spectrum, and the lack of power from the Xbox One would mean that even a 2-player split screen would be impossible to have. You can cut the resolution down for a split screen game, but since the game was locked to just 60 frames per second, having split screen would mean that the game wouldn't be able to run at that frame rate target. And at this point, 343 decided to cut it out, which is a massive error considering not only Halo's legacy of split-screen multiplayer and campaign gameplay, but 343's major focus on cooperative play would be nullified if you couldn't play locally with your friends. On the multiplayer front, the teams were running into the same issues with split-screen in large part due to Warzone. The bigger map size, increased player counts, and PvE aspect of the game mode made it extremely difficult to account for split screen. So at this point, the decision was made to just cut split screen from all modes in Halo 5. They also started to experiment with the rec system in Warzone. And for those who don't know about the rec system, it allowed players to call in requisitions from cards they would acquire from microtransaction loot boxes. And once the rec system was introduced into Warzone, 343 began planning on long-term support of recs throughout the life cycle of the game. I'll have my own bone to pick about this system a bit later on. While the engine limitations and lack of innovation were starting to catch up to the teams, the arena multiplayer teams were still tracking pretty well. At this point, they had entered the mid stage of development on the maps, and as the gameplay and Spartan abilities were pretty much complete, in fact, the arena multiplayer aspect of the game was in such a good spot that 343 had begun planning to have a beta of the vertical slice for players who purchased the Master Chief Collection. Nowadays, a lot of games have a beta or an alpha, but they aren't really alphas or betas. For Halo 5, however, the beta was being planned to be held in 2014, which was a full year before the game's release. This was a real beta, and 343 would announce it at E3 in 2014. As part of the Halo Master Chief Collection, which was due to ship in November of 2014, 343 also announced the Halo 5 beta, which would be bundled alongside the collection. The beta was to run from December 28th, 2014 until January 18th, 2015. This beta was a representative portion of what the teams had done so far for the arena multiplayer. There are still some minor issues with the gameplay that fans had identified, like the SMG being too powerful, or the feedback regarding the redesigned rocket launcher, or even certain maps like Eden having lighting issues where blue team members blended into the environment, making them really hard to spot. 343 had ample time to address this feedback from the community since the release was so far out. The overall reception to the beta was pretty positive, with most fans accepting that this multiplayer suite was leaps and bounds better than Halo 4's. The campaign was also starting to come together at this time. Despite people internally skeptical of the story, it seemed like the teams were energized to get it over the finish line, and the development was going fairly smoothly at this point. The UI teams began working on a really cool addition to the campaign, which was having a unique HUD overlay for each of the playable Spartans. Planning had also begun for the marketing of the game in late 2014. After all, the game is the next major entry into one of Microsoft's best-selling franchises. Unfortunately, this is also when things start to go downhill really fast for Halo 5.
I'm going to share some stuff that you guys are going to be like, what the f is going on? And that's kind of the point. Is the Master Chief a traitor? Is he going to die? Who's this dude that just shot him? What are you talking about? He didn't shoot him. The Master Chief was going to shoot him. Like, what? What are you guys doing to Halo? That's the point.
Retrospectively, one of the biggest failures from Halo 5 was the deceptive marketing campaigns 343 had for the game. In a vacuum, entirely ignoring the game for a moment, 343 had an incredible marketing strategy. During a season finale of The Walking Dead, they would air 2 commercials for Halo 5. One with Agent Locke seemingly taking out Master Chief, and another with the opposite, where Master Chief was the one taking out Agent Locke. This confusion led fans to come up with tons of different theories, and excitement began brewing. But just like the fans, the developers at 343 were also confused. This story that the marketing teams were telling had nothing to do with the game. In fact, this wasn't the first time the developers were confused by what was being put out there by the marketing teams. The original reveal of Halo 5 left some developers confused, as even Poncho Chief had nothing to do with the story. They were absolutely frustrated with how the game was being marketed, as it was completely misrepresenting the actual story of the game. Marketing was essentially doing whatever they wanted. This would only become even more exacerbated as the marketing team would continue with their deceiving Hunt the Truth marketing campaign. They would release the Hunt the Truth podcast, which follows a journalist who's investigating the disappearance of Master Chief. Again, just purely speaking in a vacuum here and ignoring the game, this is a really good marketing campaign. I remember listening to the episodes every week and becoming even more hyped for the game. But again, they weren't marketing the game. They were just marketing whatever captured the mass audiences with no regard to what the game was actually about. But despite the development team's extreme frustration with how the game was being marketed, work continued throughout 2015. As development began wrapping up, the main focus now was finishing up Warzone. The build was heading towards completion, but there was still a fair amount of bugs that 343 had to work out. Throughout 2015, their focus shifted towards significantly expanding the weapons sandbox. One of the key draws into Warzone would be different tiered rec cards, and for that to work, 343 had to create tiered variants of every single weapon. And since Warzone would be a monetized game mode with paid transactions, 343 had to commit to making sure the sandbox elements with the new weapons were fun and exciting to acquire and use. By July to August of 2015, 343 began ramping down on core development of the game. As it was entering completion, they began to shift their focus to supporting the game post-launch. And for those that remember, this game's post-launch support was one of the best in the industry at the time, and arguably just as expansive as many modern-day live service titles are now. 343 would also rely on Skybox Labs to reinvent their Forge mode editor. They wanted to radically change the formula of how Forge worked, so Skybox Labs would completely reinvent the entire editor. With the combination of 343 supporting the game with their own updates throughout its life cycle, and a robust Forge mode editor, where community members can make custom maps and game modes, 343 was setting up a very impressive long-term support plan for Halo 5. The game released in October of 2015, and to the surprise of everyone, minus the core developers of the game, fans hated the misleading marketing and the lackluster storyline. So they decided to immediately retcon the story going into Halo Infinite. I have an entire video on Infinite which explains the development process of that game, which goes hand in hand with this video, so definitely check it out after this one's done. To summarize, the beginning stages of development of Halo Infinite, higher ups at 343 had dedicated almost 2 years to solely upgrading the engine for that game, which allowed the teams to focus on dedicated support for Halo 5. And if I'm being brutally honest here, Halo 5 had more content added to the game in just 4 months than what Halo Infinite has had in over 4 years. 343 began pumping out content like crazy for Halo 5. Their original plan was to have a major update out every month, and since this was during a time when live service games didn't really exist in the way that we know them now, they were just labeled as updates. But if you take a look at each individual update, it's not hard to see that 343 began laying the groundwork for the industry, with each update having a seasonal theme. In 2015 alone, in just 2 months, 343 added 7 maps. Granted, most of them were Forge maps, but this was just the beginning. Since 343 also had to rely on loot boxes for the game, they would have to keep creating large sets of armor, weapons, and tiered variants, and vehicles that also had to have tiered variants. Of course, this was a lot of content to push out on a monthly basis, so 343 began relying heavily on contract work to create this extra content. Most of the armor sets created for Halo 5 were actually made by contractor work on extremely tight deadlines, which is why we have some pretty good armor sets in Halo 5 and some downright disturbing sets. But regardless, content updates continued throughout 2016, and there was a lot added to the game. There were 8 major updates, or quote-unquote seasons, added to the game throughout the year, including over 10 maps, Warzone Firefight, the custom games browser, Infection, and hundreds of recs added into the game. While on paper, for the fans, it was incredible, it wasn't sustainable for the developers. Development on Halo 5 began to taper off towards the end of 2016, as the engine upgrades for Halo Infinite were wrapping up. Alongside the core developers, contractors who were also working on Halo 5 began switching over to support development on Halo Infinite, which again has its own disastrous story. But Halo 5's development was now fully complete. But despite the massive issues with the campaign and its development, lack of split-screen campaign, and a short delay to Forge, Halo 5 ended up in a pretty good state post-launch. Development was a bit rough, but the multiplayer teams gave it their all, and with that, they would focus their attention on how they can evolve Halo next. Don't forget to leave your comments down below, as I do read most of them, and don't forget to like this video if you like this deep dive into the development of Halo 5, and subscribe for more awesome content. Thank you.